Legacy of a Traitor, Chapter 6. For it was not long before King Genra launched a brutal strike against those who took advantage of his parents' kindness, ordering for the most wretched to be executed immediately. The King's shields obeyed, as our covenant decreed. Verse 6 of the Confessional Monolith. The sun had already reached over the white-capped eastern peaks by the time Cullen was prepared to set off. He had spent the early morning inspecting the secluded area around his father's house, looking for any potential predator tracks, dangerous plant growth, and taking a closer look for any worn elements of the fence. None of these things were very likely, but they had shown up from time to time in the past. Smaller lake wolves could even wiggle up a tiny stream if they were hungry enough, and Cullen really didn't want any of them climbing into the cave outhouse, especially if his father was using it at the time. In short, he needed to ensure as much safety as possible for his father whenever he left on a foraging expedition for a couple weeks, even more so when he wasn't sure a proper bounty would be found to make it worth it. At his side was plenty of rope, his trusty pick, a handful of other tools he'd picked up on sale in the village such as a spyglass and vial set, a pack full of empty water skins for natural streams, and bottles of spices to improve the improvised dishes in the mountains. Most important of all was the leather satchel which held each of these, and would in time be filled with his elusive quarry. Currently, those essential pockets contained what were probably the last apples of the valley that Snuffler would eat, at least until they returned from the mountains. They would be her last apples of the year if they didn't return quickly enough. The past 2 weeks since Cullen had learned about the upcoming feast had been surprisingly uneventful. The excitement in town had continued to mount, but it still only manifested in the typical festival ways. The village tent had been repaired, and was being tested with smaller festivities, like the annual celebration of the mountain spirit's courageous courting, which heralded the coming cold. A renewed interest in Gemronite knickknacks was also kicking off, but that just meant Cullen could sell more of what he found in the mountains besides plants. Cullen had spent some time considering his handmade map of the mountains, plotting out a route that would give them the fastest round trip throughout the land's broken roads. Unfortunately, to get a good haul of stonegut, he would have to explore beyond the familiar mountainsides and perhaps even cross a lower pass to search the far side of the range for the first time in years. It would be tricky to accomplish in a reasonable amount of time, but with how stonegut grew, there really wasn't much of a choice. After picking a stonegut bud, it took nearly 2 full years for a second one to grow in its place. It was lucky, Cullen supposed, that they grew back at all. He had spent a few weeks picking away the stone at a lower deposit when he was much younger, trying to find some sort of tree or source that might be buried deeper, or even just another nearby bud, but it had been a fruitless search in every sense of the word. Worse than that, a new stonegut hadn't grown from there in the decade since. Cullen figured that they must grow from certain minerals embedded in specific areas, but it may as well be magic for all he knew. The next bud that would be ready in any of Cullen's marked locations wasn't due for another 3 months, so unless Snuffler found a new one by pure luck, further travel was necessary. That being said, this secondary quarry of Gemronite knickknacks and relics was now his aim. Cullen had decided to try scavenging the ruins of Traveler's Pass, and catch 2 wolves with 1 hook. As Leshen often said, it had once been the only way into the valley, but a landslide 30 years ago made that path all but impossible to travel. Cullen's father claimed it must have been done by the Gemronites, to ensure anyone who could save the Garfellians from their invasion would be cut off from the valley. Considering that they had barely moved from their citadel in all the time since, Cullen doubted that theory to be true. However, from what Cullen had seen of the destroyed pass throughout the years, with the ancient and unharmed trees right next to utterly demolished stone walls, it seemed almost too perfectly obstructed to be completely natural. Maybe it's one of those spirits at work, trying to get us and the Gemronites to be all buddy-buddy while trapped together, Cullen had said to Snuffler while smirking at the nonsense of the notion. He didn't really care either way. Scavenging the pass sometimes resulted in good material to trade, and the Gemronites didn't seem to care that he was trading their own old treasures. It was less consistent than stonegut, and Snuffler couldn't sniff that sort of treasure out, but it was worth a shot to keep up with the increased quota requirements. It would be difficult, but that's what the Gemronites demanded of Cullen just to give his father a comfortable life. You know, if Cernir had been kind enough to tell us about this quota increase a few months ago, we could have saved one of the nearby stonegut locations. Let's hope there's not some monstrous spirit lying in wait just off the old pass, huh? Cullen scratched Snuffler's head, and she grunted in affirmation. If that happens, you'll protect me, won't you, girl? Either way, we'll need some sort of backup plan beyond looking for rusted metal. Another one of these celebrational feasts, Cullen waved his hands in mock exaggeration as he walked past the nearly empty farmers' fields, and we'll be forced to make some accommodations. Yeeg and the other farmers were putting the last touches on the harvest cart. The fall crops would be fully gathered by the time Cullen and Snuffler returned. In fact, it was probably possible that this whole feast business would be over and done by then, too. He felt a little pain of sadness at that, despite himself. Sure, the actual event probably had malicious intent behind it, but the way that old Galila, Yeeg, and the others spoke of their plans for that day made him begin to doubt that nothing good would come of it. Though maybe it was just the description of the dire duck roast that was set to be served that dredged up these pointless thoughts. Ah well, if we miss it, I'll be sure to treat you to something excellent stuff. Maybe even a piece of stone gut if our luck decides to shift. Who knows how our haul will be? She grunted excitedly in response, and Cullen scratched the top of her head. By that night, their ascent of the base of the mountains had begun. It was always an enjoyable challenge to scale the steep paths, as the ever-increasing slope of the Carfelian Mountains made it an effort that grew in difficulty every step of the way. The first mile after entering the forest at the base was considered by some mapmakers in the village to still be within the peaceful valley itself, considering that the ground barely seemed to rise. It was clear that none of them had ever traveled in the harsher seasons. Cullen had navigated flash floods from the melting mountainsides rushing down in the springtime, and dealt with pitfalls hidden under fallen leaves and snow in the later months, and he wasn't without a few scars to prove it. The rising land was slight, but it could be dangerously fierce. However, fierce as it could be, it was also tasty in equal measure. Not only was food plentiful in the berries, nuts, and the small game camouflaged about in the outskirts of the valley, streams rising from the mountain's core would constantly spill out in rivulets just under the veil of trees, fresh and clear as the rain itself. It was warm as blood even during the winter, and so even the colder months bore no absence of sustenance for Cullen, though it tended to be harder to find. Regardless, it made packing for food and water a breeze, as all that he needed from the village were a handful of special spices. Together with the mountain's bounty, they made every meal a little feast. Eventually, the side of the mountains would rise in earnest, making it impossible to climb without the scant few paths, many of which were in terrible shape due to being abandoned decades ago. It wasn't unusual for Cullen to find a section of the path completely unusable after a harsh storm, entire chunks of the ground being shattered apart or covered by massive boulders. To think that entire wagons could travel in and out of the valley 30 years ago was remarkable, and it became harder to imagine with every broken bridge, fallen walkway, and crumbled tunnel that Cullen encountered. However, he had been clambering over and around all of that for years, and now it was simply a way to keep in practice after weeks of rest between expeditions. Of course, what was practice for Cullen was a simple stroll for Snuffler. As a mountain boar, she would clamber up nearly vertical rock walls for a small shoot of fallflower, stretches of rock which Cullen couldn't hope to even attempt without his pick and rope. She had certainly come a long way since Cullen found her shivering on a cliff face above a pack of hungry lake wolves, though even then her skill had impressed him. It was lucky that a nest of blood flies had been on a nearby tree branch, or else he wouldn't have been able to scare off the thin-skinned predators in time. The throne hive had exploded into a fierce swarm that had dispersed the pack, gurgling and yelping as the flesh-burrowing bugs chased them away. After the swarm had finally flown off, the two bleeding youngsters made it to safety. The wounds they'd received, both Cullen's blood-fly burrows and Snuffler's lake wolf bite wounds, eventually healed and faded away, but their bond never waned. Ever since that day, they'd been inseparable. Nothing could ever change that. Seeing her spirited dash about mounds and cliffsides covered in tangled shoots and roots, all under the shadow of trees swaying overhead in the wind made visible by the swirling storm of leaves falling from the highest peaks, why, it reminded Cullen once again of the reason he loved this untamed land so much. The more it reclaimed the paths and bridges, the more it turned into a wild, pure thing, one that danced undefiled, beckoning only to those worthy to meet it and know it. Such a place would cause most Carfelians to flee back to the safety of hearth and home, especially the Frennets and their ilk, but it was where Cullen knew he belonged with every invigorating sensation he felt in the midst of the wilderness. Of course, he had to earn that belonging every hour of the day. Without proper knowledge of the stone in the cliffs, the crevices under shadows and leaves, or the signs of ground protected by a passel of mountain boars, injury would never be more than a few moments away. He had carefully taught himself for more than half his life to respect the Carfell Mountains, never thinking himself their master. In turn, they provided him with opportunities to learn how to carry onward without harm, and how to extract the material goodness within that the rest of the valley craved. Certain strains of rock would be colored differently in moonlight, marking the lined veins that were sturdier than the rest and easy to climb. Scarred and splintered trees lined the outskirts of the boar's domain, and whenever he failed to notice such things, Snuffler would be there to warn him. The days flew by as usual, and by the week's end, Cullen had finally arrived at Traveler's Pass. Being only at half the altitude of the tallest peaks, the ruins of the pass were not as hard to get to as other landmarks of the mountains, not by a long shot. As such, there were often a few young folk who would venture out to see the sight, though most only made it to the mountain base before they got tired and returned home. But the few that made it to the top got to catch a glimpse of the world beyond the Carphelian Valley, the vast land of shivering red and gray that could be seen between the sparse breaks in the clouds, a land that seemed to stretch forever onwards. The ruins themselves were not nearly as impressive, mostly a few chunks of rotted wood planks and the sporadic debris of old mangled stone spread over several hundred feet of the mountain slope, almost entirely covered by lawn-shifted soil. They nearly reached the old path and the sheer cliffs on either side of the long stretch of land that used to make up the only way into the valley. Traveler's Pass had apparently been one of the first Generite outposts, well before the citadels had been made, but probably like every land they left behind, it had been forgotten and left to rot. After setting up camp by the best overlook and admiring the view, Cullen began to investigate some of the larger heaps of wood and stone, carefully excavating the dirt around the fragments of the past. Snuffler rooted around the base of some of the old trees nearby, but soon grew bored at the poor fare and laid down for a nap. Cullen smiled as she snored peacefully. This was how it usually went up in these ruins. Though old weapons, armor, and even a few folds of rotting cloth could be found if one was lucky and perceptive enough, they all gave off the same stench of old dirt, making the sensitive nose of poor Snuffler feel insufficient. The sun was high, and though the mountains were usually quite chilly around this time of year, the wind had taken a bit of a reprieve today, and the leafless trees weren't blocking any of the light. It was strange to think that this place, which had held so much bustle and chaos at one point in time, had become so peaceful, so full of beauty and regal calm. Only here could he look into the valley where the citadel was scarcely more than a tiny silver stick in an ocean of familiar golden waves, then turn around and look out into the world beyond with its vast mystery and promise of terrifying wonder. Upon these heights, the whole of existence was his to enjoy. Cullen considered following Snuffler's lead for a time, kicking back and enjoying the beautiful weather, but he shook his head and continued his work. These sorts of days were certainly blessings, but elusively dangerous ones. With a shift in the wind and the passing of only a few more hours, a sudden storm could cover the pass in deathly thick snow. If he hadn't found anything by that point, he never would. The sun had only just crested its bright zenith when Cullen finally found something of note. He had traveled about 100 feet to the north, down the side of the mountain where the landslide had occurred, when a section of squarish rock caught his eye several feet off the path of crumbled stone. It was overgrown with moss, and the brickwork was so fine that Cullen would have mistaken it for a natural boulder if it wasn't as angular as the citadel itself. It was nearly 5 feet wide, and seemed fairly sunken down into the earth. As he approached it, he found that it was less so naturally sunken, and more that it rested in a crater that had mostly been obscured by the tall plants growing out of it. Cullen brushed these aside, looking for an opening, some sort of break in the stonework. To his pleasant surprise, a full window appeared on the west side, the glass that had once been housed within completely shattered. He carefully poked at it with a stick, checking if any creature happened to make its nest there before he peered inside. No stepping turtle or snake popped out to meet him. He grinned. "Let's see what you've got for me." Such complete sections of the former outpost were decently rare, and most had already been cleared out by Generites and other travelers decades ago. A few seconds later, he let out a whoop of excitement as this thing proved to be an exception. Almost immediately, Cullen found a dagger, rusted and encrusted with dirt, but still shining with the green tint found only in old Generite tools. It wasn't just the color that proved it to be authentic. There was a slight inscription of symbols and strange lettering along the blade and hilt. Perhaps the Generites were so forgetful, or maybe so greedy, that they had to write their own names down on their tools so that everyone would know whose they were. Cullen smiled at the thought, though he knew it was a rather unfair assessment. However, since he couldn't read it, he could make up whatever he wanted for now, and that was far more fun to do. After mocking the ego of the Generites and admiring their craftsmanship, Cullen took another look inside of the outpost fragment. Surely there wouldn't be another item so valuable as the dagger, but just maybe there would be something like... He froze as another object's form became hideously clear as he brought it into the light. A skull, chipped and cracked, but clearly human, rested in his hand. Instinctively, and with no small amount of revulsion, he dropped it with a shout. Snuffler came running up, snorting with concern after being woken up by his previous excitement. I'm all right, girl. Just surprised, that's all. He'd seen many animal bones throughout his life, both from old nests and from hunts for food, but he'd never seen a human's bone like this before. The very sight of it prodded at some unnamed fear in the back of his mind. It just seemed so viscerally unnatural. The holes where the eyes should go were too large, and the mouth was locked in a grin so forced and still that it gave Cullen shivers. To think I have something like this in my head right now, he whispered, and that it'll be all that's left when I die. A second flash of fear pierced through him. Was this who he'd been? Cullen took a deep breath, clearing away such thoughts. No, this person had been here since the landslide, as it was beneath a chunk of ruins. He should focus instead on what this skull told him. Why was this thing here at all? Cullen had never seen such bones whenever he had searched the pass in the past. It was common knowledge that the Generites had investigated the landslide a few days after it occurred, and they had conducted an attempted cleanup operation that was deemed impossible, so perhaps there had been more casualties than the Carfelians had been informed of. As different thoughts connected, Cullen began to realize something very important. He focused, scratching Snuffler all the while as she relaxed after sensing his restored calm. Why had the Generites slowed their attempted integration with the Carfelians after the landslide? They had appreciated the help from beyond the valley in the form of odd visitors more than anyone else, and yet they didn't seem to put any major effort into trying to restore Traveler's Pass. Secondly, had there truly been a noticeable decrease in the Generite population after the landslide? Cullen wasn't old enough to know from personal experience, but upon finding that the skull was left, that might have actually been true, considering their desire to withdraw into the safety of their citadels. Perhaps they wanted to hide the fact that their numbers had dwindled for fear of appearing weak. If the Generites had only a handful of losses, they would have put more effort into finding every corpse for proper burial. How many lives had the landslide taken if they had lost track of how many there were? Ultimately, the hidden truth about the Generites was becoming ever clearer to Cullen. They were scared. Scared of a world that they thought could turn on them and kill them at any moment. That was why they had remained in their citadels for so long, why they refused to attempt recreating the pass. They were all scared stiff of having a similar tragedy befall them, and scared that the Carfelians would learn of their weakness. If it was known how easily the Generites would bend to any real danger, what incentive would the people of the valley have to continue giving them the quotas they demanded for protection? Well, aside from the knickknacks and surney, but even those could be made cheaper upon Carfelian demand. The true power of the valley had always laid in the hands of Cullen's people. Cullen glanced again at the leering skull. Such a feeling was strange. He felt increasingly vulnerable and fearful in his primal being upon seeing this visage of death itself, yet far more powerful and assured in his conscious mind upon realizing that the Generites held so little sway over him. It was all a lot to take in. If he was able to find a way to aid his father, would he be able to avoid giving his part of the quota away to the Generites, instead selling it at higher prices to wealthy individuals in the village? If so, then his vision of one day finding a way to break free from the Generites and living in the mountains would be achieved. And yet, in a way, isn't that just what he had accomplished already by discovering this skull? Cullen shook his head. No, simply because there was a human skull here didn't mean that the Generites were weak. It had been 30 years after all. Maybe this was a typical burial location before the landslide, or perhaps this skull belonged to someone that was reviled and abandoned after death. It was silly to jump to such sweeping conclusions. And yet, he couldn't help but feel like an ephemeral chain had vanished. He would investigate, prod a little further than usual at the Citadel. If more evidence piled up of the Generites' fear, then a world of possibilities would open. He stood up and stretched. Besides, even if this was all a result of overthinking, he had found an excellent dagger to sell. All the worries of providing for his father for the next couple months were over and done with, and there was still plenty of daylight left. If he could find one artifact, then surely another wouldn't be impossible, and there were probably mushrooms slightly further down the hill. Searching for them would be a shady summer's jaunt, and no other disturbing discoveries would be that likely. Nothing like that skull, surely. Of course not. That was just a one-time thing that Cullen could leave behind without any... Cullen closed his eyes and took a deep breath. No, he couldn't just let whoever that was remain unburied like that. It was already too late to give the flesh honor for a life lived now that it had been fully decomposed, but at least the bones could be granted rest, despite the wretched thoughts that arose when he looked at it. As he expected, the skull had been part of a full skeleton, though its owner must have been rather poor. Not a single object other than that dagger was near the bones, as all of the clothes must have been simply made of cloth, and so were rotted away after all these decades. Snuffler sniffed at the bones, but she found no sense of note clinging to them. She seemed to find them a little disconcerting as well, and so remained a few feet away as Cullen carried them to a section of the woods with softer soil. Cullen wasn't sure what the afterworld looked like. The Genernites spoke of a new land entirely, somewhere deep in the sky where the spirits and the dead lived together, but that seemed to be based on nothing but wishful thinking and a sense of raw arrogance. The people of the valley had long believed that the realm of the dead was an unveiled landscape of familiarity, a perfected version of their home without lake wolves, cold, or aging. This realm was to be left alone by the living in every way, lest spoken words or memory might draw the departed spirits back to a halfway existence in both realms. Such had it been in the oldest stories of the valley itself, stories which never named their heroes for this very reason. Regardless, he was sure that the dead would prefer an act of dignified finality performed on their former flesh than nothing at all. He stopped in a small glade, one with an excellent view over a precipice of the range to the unknown red lands of the north, and still within sight of the sloped woods and the old path. The two of them dug together silently, Cullen unsure of what to say that would be fitting. There were no real indicators of who this might have been, and the bones seemed fairly intact for being crushed in a landslide, with only a distinct breakage in the spine and ribs, as if a falling fence post or wooden pole had dashed through them. That must have rotted as well. It took slightly longer than he had expected, given that his foraging spade wasn't the best for digging a small grave, but they finished putting on the final layer of dirt and stone long before nightfall. Well, long before nightfall at the top of these mountains, at least. The way that the Garfelian range rose up all around the valley, the sun would disappear behind the peaks at least a couple hours before it would descend behind the faraway horizon to someone standing upon the mountains. Now that the grisly task was done, Cullen felt quite relieved, and he walked over to the precipice to enjoy the wonderful view as he wiped his brow. He couldn't help but feel a little proud that he was able to provide such a perfect resting place to that poor soul in so short a time. The way the sun would set in the west would cause the whole of the red lands to flare in brilliant crimson every night, all while the leaves would change in color across the seasons as you looked from the heights to the depths of the range thousands of feet below, far lower than even the lake of the valley. However, as he gazed out over the steep precipice, something sent the tiniest jolt of concern into his mind. It was so slight that it manifested more as a gut instinct than anything substantially conscious. The spread of verdant, unchanged leaves on the lower elevation was an odd sight, but nothing out of the ordinary for this time of year, so what was it? Cullen narrowed his eyes, squinting for a good few seconds before Snuffler nudged his pack a couple times. Huh? What do you need, Snuff? Oh, right. He opened it and took out the new spyglass. Thanks, girl. Forgot about this. He rummaged further in the pack and gave her an apple. Probably what she was asking for in the first place anyway, as a reward for her digging skills. Then, carefully focusing the crystal within, he scanned the land for what was gnawing at his senses. The spyglass was wonderfully made, he had to admit, and it wasn't long before he caught a flash of a bright red color moving among the trees about a mile down. It was far too big to be a crest bird, and besides, there were others behind it. Cullen set down the spyglass and thought for a moment. He had seen strangely dappled herds of deer before, their coats a ruddy brunette which positively flashed in the setting sunlight, but even they never had such a bright red color like the shapes he had just seen. Cullen's curiosity continued to climb, and soon he found himself moving further down the far side of the Garfelian mountains. Snuffler huffed a warning after gulping down the last of the apple. It seemed she could sense something was off as well. "Stay here, girl." She was quiet, but still large and boisterous enough to cause complications. Don't worry, I'll be careful. These things, whatever they are, won't even know I'm there." He gave her a reassuring smile and continued walking silently forward, checking the spyglass every minute or so as she laid her head down, snorting quietly in concern. The creatures were tall, nearly reaching up to the height of the nearby branches 6 feet off the ground. Even so, they were thin, almost as if they were humans trekking up the steep mountainside, something which hadn't happened for the entirety of Cullen's life. He smiled at the ridiculous notion. Imagine that, some group of people foolish enough to climb up thousands of feet of cliffside on such an unstable pathway. Cullen had been traversing these perilous peaks for years, and even he would balk at attempting such a thing. However, as they were within about 500 feet, Cullen's smile began to fade. Somehow, the impossibility continued to grow into reality, until he could clearly see 4 men dressed in full suits of colored glass. 2 in crimson, 2 in dark bronze, with thick black beards the size of beehives covering almost all of what appeared to be tanned and fierce-looking faces. The sight of them through the spyglass sent an immediate jolt of surprise and intrigue running through Cullen, and though he had mostly been hidden, he crouched further behind a tree, putting his back to the trunk. Immediately, his father's many stories of monsters and threats that roamed the world beyond rushed into his head, and his heartbeat grew fast with fear. The Genronites were treacherous, despite their gifts, but too slow-acting to be an immediately present concern. However, the creatures his father spoke of would refuse to even speak before unleashing the full weight of their brutality. He'd never given such stories much weight, but such an immediate sight brought them into horrifying reality. What would happen if they entered the valley? They would murder and enslave everyone at a whim. Yeek, Therina, his father, even his father. Come on, calm down. Every monster in those tales had a weakness. Cullen glanced back at the 4 outsiders and tried to place them in any of the stories his father had drilled into him ever since he could remember. The pattern each of them wore on their chest was reminiscent of some symbol, but it was still quite foreign to him. Their red and bronze garments, with swirling black marks, reminded him of the story of the ocean savages from beneath the waves, but they lacked the distinctive black horns which grew out of their head and chest, as well as the blazing yellow eyes. In fact, aside from the excessive facial hair and odd clothing, there wasn't really anything which separated them from a normal human. They didn't even seem to carry any weapons, aside from a simple dagger each, though it was oddly shaped and overly extensive. At this point, he could hear them speaking to each other, exhaustion and concern evident in their words despite their strange language, as they shot each other glances of barely restrained anger. It was far more stilted than the flowing Genronite tongue, but it had a bouncy tone that accentuated every other word in a way that sounded almost jovial. A wave of relief shook Cullen to his core. These outsiders weren't monsters, not at all. And given that they weren't nearly as nature-worn as a group this high up would be expected to, then they might even be merchants, like the ones that traded stories for goods with his father long ago. However, it wouldn't be a good idea to test this here, especially since communication would be all but impossible. It wasn't likely they knew the Carfelian language well, and Cullen knew nothing of any other tongue. If they were merchants, then they must be scouts leading a larger caravan of goods where they could rest and recuperate. And if that was true, then the sheer incline of this route would mean it must not be that far behind. As he waited and watched, Cullen began to make up his mind. These figures were remarkably unobservant and inexperienced with mountain travel. They seemed to step on every stick and pebble heap possible. Their speech was obnoxiously loud, and they would slip and tumble at least once per minute. That last one was probably the biggest reason why they seemed so irritable toward each other, but maybe they were just unsavory sorts anyway. If these scouts were unable to locate him, then none of the others would have the slightest chance. Cullen would find their caravan, sneak in, and see if he could learn more about them. A wide grin grew over his face, and Cullen slipped back with silent steps into the trees, watching the oblivious men until the forest covered them from view. Despite how inexperienced the scouts had seemed, they had still traveled several hundred feet up the steep mountain, which was well more than Cullen had expected. Strange red flowers dotted the hillside too, and Cullen stopped by one of them to investigate. He'd never seen anything like it in the valley, with its curved and folded bulb tightly bound into a sphere. He knelt down to pluck it, and found that there were no roots or stem beneath. It felt strange too, as if it was made of dried animal skin or some other non-floral material. His curiosity as a forager continued to grow, and he pulled one of the petals outward. Immediately, a fine red sand began spilling out from it onto the ground. So the merchants must have brought these from their land. Did they make them? They certainly didn't seem to be natural flowers. Maybe they were meant to be markers so they could find their way back to camp. Cullen looked down the mountain, noticing many more among the greenery, and he nodded to himself. He carefully put the red flower into his satchel, and began following the trail of crimson, smiling as he went. This was more exciting than he'd anticipated. As expected, their camp lay within eyesight after just a few minutes, and the second surprise of these merchants appeared before Cullen with it. His eyes widened, and he ducked behind a tree again as a massive array of strange pointy tents and flags in the same crimson and bronze color appeared below him upon a tiny plateau jutting out from the side of the mountain. Within a small wall barely a few feet high, it looked like there were more people than in the village. They swarmed about like festival-goers in the height of summer, but instead of sampling sweets or bidding on items, they were repairing tools like the lawn daggers from before and oblong axes, carrying wood and oddly shaped stones, and shouting orders at each other in the same jovial language as the scouts. As he continued watching from his perch, he realized that there were almost no children or women among the massive number of 400 bearded individuals. That is, unless they were a people who grew beards regardless of age or gender. But if that was the case, how could they tell each other apart? Beyond the large camp, Cullen got a good view of a large rut in the woods that led down the mountain. It looked like a great giant from the old stories had dragged something heavy across the ground up the slope and left what seemed to be a trail. Cullen gasped as he fumbled for the spyglass and peered through it with wide eyes. Yes, there was absolutely no mistaking it. There were braces put along the edges of the trail made of wooden stakes, and the road itself had been flattened down by many carved stones. Why, there were still more being added. Cullen saw a good number of men even deeper into the woods laying them down, taking them from carts pulled by strange scaled beasts with tongues that flicked like snakes. No wonder there were so many men. They were trying to restore the old pathway that led to the valley. Cullen had never imagined it could be done because he had never pictured so many working together on the same thing. How did they keep themselves fed? There must be another few hundred somewhere all focused on hunting and foraging, and even more of them focused on finding water. Cullen slumped down in amazement. So many merchants. They must be carrying goods unlike anything the valley had ever seen. Just maybe, the appearance of these outsiders would work to bring out some of that much-needed fear in the hearts of the Genernites. If they were to know that a new group of outsiders selling even better wares at a much cheaper price were to arrive, and that their snakeskin selves could be replaced, they would be falling over themselves to renounce their greed. Maybe I could speed up the process a bit. What could I do to prove their existence to Warlord Cernir? Cullen got up and continued observing the camp, carefully looking with the spyglass for telling details. On further inspection, there seemed to be a definite split amongst them, as there had been with the scouts earlier. There were the crimson glass-dressed ones and the bronze-looking ones, each with a side of the tent village that was clearly separated from the other. They were so similar in many ways. Their appearance and tools, aside from the color of their clothing, were practically identical, but there was certainly a division between them. Alongside the different colors, there were two different symbols on many tiny waving banners on each side. Were they the symbol of each group? If so, Cullen could take one from each, and that would speak far louder than any words he could give Cernir. But how could he do so without getting seen? Even if he was careful, there were so many eyes flashing back and forth that he might be spotted by sheer chance. If the people of the valley's first interaction with these outsider merchants was of perceived thievery and sneakiness, then this whole plan might fall through. Cullen sat down and thought for a moment, and found Snuffler's absence a discomfort. It would be better if he was away from the merchant camp while he planned this out anyway, in case they had other scouts returning from higher up the mountain who would see him. As he began moving back up the path, Cullen found himself glancing behind, trying to get a final look at the camp and the surrounding area before it went out of view. As he realized that his heart had been beating far faster than usual, and his thoughts began to calm, the reality struck him harder than the shock of seeing the scouts had. These were people who had never seen the valley. They were from that land I've only dreamed of seeing, and they're right here. What they wore, the way they spoke, how they acted, the tools they used, it was all exactly what I wanted to know, and it's happening now. Not in a dream, not in a thought. They're standing within eyesight. He needed to know more about them, But would he have to wait until they entered the valley? Could he offer a gift for a first impression? Or would that end up being an insult if they had unusual sensibilities? No, getting something for free was something any human would like. But what sort of item would these merchants desire in particular? Stone gut? A wooden trinket? Or maybe even a... Cullen didn't have time to finish that thought, as in his haze of planning he stepped on one of the strange red flowers, and it exploded into a large, crackling, deep crimson puff of smoke. The sound was intense, like a bonfire made from damp logs all contained into a tiny space, and Cullen stumbled to the ground in shock. The flower registered in his mind a second after he'd stepped on it, and he cursed his lack of focus. This thing was more than a marker. It was some sort of signal trap made by the merchants. Cullen scrambled to his feet as the plume of red smoke soared upwards, still crackling and snapping with a fiercely aggressive sound. He rushed into the nearby brush, taking a deep breath to calm the dull thud of his heart. Come on, how could he have let his thoughts run away like that? Now was not the time to abandon all of the calm surety he'd mastered over years of exploration. Immediately, he heard the inquisitive and guarded shout of one of the scouts. They must have already been returning, and now they were only a few feet away. Cullen peered out from the brush and saw the four of them enter the clearing. He stifled a gasp as the face of the nearest one sent a cold jolt through him, pushing him further into the greenery. What was that expression on the scout's face? It looked like a storm cloud set into a stone figure, restrained fury incarnate. Cullen grit his teeth as he heard their steps come even closer. He'd messed up. They had probably expected a call in return, and now they knew that something unknown was hiding before them. They hadn't seen him yet, so they probably thought he was nothing more than a beast who'd activated their flower, but there was something about the intensity of their stare that yelled at Cullen to remain hidden. As they approached, each one drew their long daggers, and they began to spread out, circling the brush, preventing any easy escape. These were just merchants, right? They shouldn't be that dangerous, at least according to his father's stories. But those were stories from 30 years ago. Maybe the dangers of the outside world had grown, and they now needed to be ready to fight whenever they felt threatened, and they certainly seemed to feel threatened now. Talking wasn't an option, so what could he do? Cullen's mind raced, but nothing was coming to him. Just as one of the scout's hands brushed the outer leaves and panic set in, a hideous and familiar muffled scream was unleashed from higher up the mountain. Everyone's attention snapped to the newcomer, and Cullen almost laughed in amazement and raw fear upon seeing her. Snuffler was running down the mountainside, a tree branch with a nest of blood flies attached to it held firmly in her jaw, and she was waving it about as a weapon. All of the scouts immediately turned towards her, eyes wide and shouts wavering, and they brandished their daggers towards her as best they could, their focus completely away from Cullen. Thanks, Snuff, Cullen thought as he dove out of the bushes on the lower side, dashing quietly beyond the edge of the clearing before the scouts could notice. Now just be careful. She must have sniffed out the sickly honey the blood flies created after sensing Cullen was in danger, which meant she had noticed the fierce nature of the scouts well before Cullen had. Snuffler's thick hide protected her as blood flies crawled on her skin, trying to find a way to puncture it, but she just kept waving the hive back and forth, still squealing out a warning to the scouts who were backing up slowly. Trying to assess such a situation quickly would be nearly impossible for most men, so Cullen was concerned that they seemed to be doing just that. If they hurt her... To Cullen's surprise and rising concern, they stopped retreating. He saw them shift their stances quickly as their fear changed to a determined focus. One of each color suddenly stepped forward, raising their blades so eagerly that they were pushing the other out of the way, as if each were in some dire competition. Cullen began to feel himself about to yell or to throw something, anything to divert their attention, when Snuffler finally swung the nest forward and released it from her jaw, sending it flying with a mighty throw. As it collided with the advancing scouts, the nest exploded into a burst of gray strips and a dark cloud of red-winged terror. Snuffler's screams were immediately outmatched by the piercing shriek of the scouts, who tried to bat away the flesh-burrowing bugs for half a moment before dropping their weapons and stumbling down the mountain at a breakneck speed. A sense of pride washed over Cullen as he whistled for Snuffler to follow him up the mountain and away from the chaos. "Great job, Snuff! That reward I mentioned is as good as yours," he whispered as he ran up to him, huffing with exertion and glee. Though Cullen was relieved that Snuffler was safe after such a risky move, and touched that she had gone so far after noticing his own distress, He couldn't help but feel a little bad for the scouts. Bloodflies would attack threats to their nest by digging into skin with their circular stinger. If they weren't removed in time, they would then burrow into the skin after creating a large enough wound to wreak havoc until the target left. It took a little while for that to happen, though, so they would probably be fine if they could pull them off before a big puncture was made. As he carefully looked back down the mountain to see if any of the scouts or their allies were returning, Cullen noticed sections of the glass clothing lay strewn about a few feet down. There was one of each color of the chest pieces, which held exactly the same design as the banners at the camp. They must have flung them off to get at the bloodflies beneath. After making sure the hideous insects were gone, Cullen picked them up to investigate. How strange, they weren't made of glass. They looked like it, but the material bent in his hands slightly, like a bouquet of sturdy flowers. Tapping seemed to reveal it to be a fairly durable piece of armor, but he had no idea what it could be made of. He didn't have time to think about that now, though. The dust from the crushed flower was still rising, and those scouts would be bringing many more of their friends to this place within a few minutes. "I'm sure they won't mind if we borrow these for a bit, so long as we return them anonymously, right, girl?" His mischievous smile prompted an agreeable snort from Snuffler, and he hung the armor straps onto his satchel. "Let's go. That was way too close." As the pair made it back to Traveler's Pass, the moon was already high in the sky. "No point in looking for anything else. This news is better than anything we could have found." Cullen shivered as he thought about it, though it was probably from the cold. "Do you think that those merchants will be a little less riled up when they reach the village?" "I certainly hope so. They were rather jumpy." Cullen grinned as he scratched Snuffler's head. "I suppose that makes us even when it comes to bloodfly rescues. Let's see if we can keep it that way. I barely made it out without getting stung." As he fed her the rest of the apples, he thought about the now swiftly forming plan. With the amount of people at that camp, they were certain to eventually make their way into the valley, but Cullen wasn't sure when that would actually happen. Even with so many men, it was clear that their progress was slow, and that it would take them many days, if not months, to finally build their trail to reach Traveler's Pass. It was entirely possible they would be held up by the oncoming winter. In these heights, such a situation would be downright deadly, but Cullen expected that these outsiders had already taken that into consideration. For all he knew, they might have an item which could keep the winter away for a time, but even so, it would still take a while to finally crest the peak. There would be plenty of time for the Genernites to reform and create a wondrous society free from their old stingy and subterfuge-filled ways. All Cullen would have to do is bring up this threat to their rule, and if the Genernites were scared, they'd be forced to make amends. It would be even easier considering the aggressively fearsome appearance of these merchants. "You know, Snuff, when I was talking with Father about how we could get all of the Genernites to be scared out of their snaky skins, I never expected such an opportunity to come knocking at our door." He snapped his fingers as a thought from that conversation fit perfectly in his plot. "Ah, why don't we make them out to be those lord-lopping beastmen in Father's story? They sure seem hairy enough, and it would scare the Genernites into abandoning their position altogether. Then, when these outsiders appear, we can pretend that their sole desire to sell things is entirely because the Genernites left their lofty tower. We'd get a host of new trading partners for the first time in decades, the snakes would lose all of their advantages over us, and everyone would be none the wiser." Snuffler snorted, pleased to be part of whatever this plan was as Cullen rubbed his hands, partly to get some extra warmth in them, partly in anticipation for the upcoming meeting with Cernier, a meeting he just knew would change the lives of everyone in the valley forever. In a matter of days, the masters of the valley would be in the palm of his hand.